So I am going to talk to you about the IRB process. This is basically a process that you do need to go through before you actually begin your study. So once you have basically designed your study in its entirety, then you do need to get IRB approval if you are working with human subjects or animal subjects in your research. If you aren't using human subjects or animal subjects, then you don't have to go through this process. But if you are, then you do need to make sure that you go through this process before you begin your study. And does anyone know what the IRB board does, the Institutional Review Board? What is the purpose of this board? Does anyone know? Brittany and Andrew? Since you guys have both gone through this process, what is the purpose of the IRB?
It's basically to protect either animals or humans. They want to make sure the research is ethical, so you're not going and messing with people's psyche, maybe in our case, or doing things that put participants in more danger than necessary, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional.
Exactly, absolutely, absolutely. So if there's any kind of risk of harm, right, they want to be able to assess the ethics behind your study. And that does include, kind of like what Brittany mentioned, it doesn't just mean physical harm, it does also mean psychological harm as well. So the IRB board does this review. Otherwise, if there is harm that does take place, then there are kind of legal liabilities. So if you go through this IRB process, then that protects you as well as the institution. So it is essential that you do go through this process. So I gave you a handout that kind of outlines the major points about the IRB. But of course, if you want more detailed information, so once you actually are going to go through this process, I definitely recommend that you go through this website. On our UIS website about our IRB process at our institution. I'll highlight some of the main things so you can kind of get an idea of where to find different information, and I'll go through that as we kind of go through the major points. So there's actually two different committees. There's the Institutional Review Board for human subjects. So if your research involves human subjects, then you would go through that process. If you're working with animals in your research, then that is through the Institutional Committee for the Care and Use of Animals. So they're actually two separate processes. So depending on whether you're working with humans or animals, then you will go through the process that's relevant to your research. This does include course projects as well, so if you're doing research projects as part of a course, you actually still do have to go through the IRB process. And of course that includes independent research that you are doing with a faculty mentor. But even capstone projects or a master's thesis, if you are uncertain if your research project should go through the IRB process, then do make sure that you check with the IRB here at UIS. Just to be sure, just to be safe in figuring out whether or not you need to go through this process before you actually begin your research. Okay? So with the research with human subjects, this is the page where you will get your general information about the IRB process for working with human subjects. And so the first thing that you actually need to do before you actually even submit a protocol is there is a training that is required. That is something that is new this year. So, if you've gone through this process before in the past, it is different this year. The training and information about the training is under this link, Required Training. So if you go here, it will provide you with all the information for the city training, instructions on how to go through that. For any research, the basics with human subjects is you will have to go through these 6 modules listed right here. But there are also a number of additional modules that, if it's relevant to your research, that you need to do in addition to those 6. So for example, if you're doing research with prisoners, or if you're doing research with children, or if you're doing internet research, then there are additional modules that you have to do in addition to kind of the basic 6. You do need to also get a minimum passing score of 80 per module as you go through this. Basically, once you get into the module, there are a number of readings, you do the readings, there's some questions afterwards, and you answer those questions, and that's what the score is based on, is the number of correct answers. If you do happen to get less than 80, it's not a huge big deal. You can kind of go through the process again and retake the test. So if you don't get that 80 that first time, it's okay. Okay? Any questions about the city training? It is something that is done once every 3 years. So if you later on decide to do another project, as long as you've kind of gone through the training once before, within that 3-year time period, you don't have to go through it again. The IRB office will keep that on file. Okay?
Yeah, it's not hard. I took it as a non-psychology person, but it's not hard, but it does take some time.
Yes.
So you just have to plan ahead to do
Yes, absolutely. And everyone who's involved in the research project does have to do that. So if other students are helping out in some way, or your faculty mentor, they all have to kind of go through this training. And you actually get a certificate at the end that you do have to attach with your IRB proposal.
Is it just something you do in your own time then? Like
Yes,
online?
yes, it's online, it's on your own time. Yeah. All right. So after the training, then you can actually begin to work on your protocol. And so if you go to the Human Subjects Protocol form, this is where you'll get the actual application form. It is quite lengthy. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Basically, what this form does is it breaks down your study and asks for all the detailed information about the various components of your study. And so you do need to make sure that you have a very clear idea and you have figured out exactly how you're going to carry out your study. Make sure that you do provide as much detail as you can on this form, because if the IRB board looks at it and has questions about certain aspects of your study, then they will kick that back to you and you will have to kind of fill in the blanks and then resubmit it. So the best bet is for you to provide as much information as you can, as detailed as you can, so it gets you more quickly through this approval process. And I would definitely recommend, of course, that you have your faculty mentor kind of go through that with you to make sure that you've kind of covered all the bases and answered all the questions as thoroughly as possible. Okay? But it does kind of walk you through the entire thing. Any questions about that? All right. In addition to your application form, oftentimes you will also have to provide supporting documentation. So you definitely have to have an informed consent form, and you may also have a debriefing form, but there may be also other forms that you may include depending on what your research is on. So for example, where I've done research studies where we have to interview participants, then we would actually have an interview protocol that outlines what are the general questions that we're going to be asking the participants, and that might be something to include. Or in psychological research, oftentimes we have questionnaires or measures that we're going to use. Then we also have to include a copy of that with our application as a supporting document. So the IRB board can kind of look over your questions and determine if there are any concerns with the questions and the measures that you are using. Okay. So you want to think about what are the different kinds of supporting documentations you might need. If you are using standardized measures that are published, oftentimes you also have to get permission in order to use them, and so you also need to make sure that you provide that kind of documentation as well. Okay. Questions about any of that? No? Okay. So there are, what is helpful about this website is that they also do provide different templates for the different forms that you might use. So you'll see there's a debriefing form template that you can use. There's also an informed consent checklist. So when you develop your informed consent form, there's a checklist to make sure that you cover all the important aspects, because again, if there's any information that's missing, they're going to make you kind of redo that and resubmit it. So definitely take a look at these forms and use these forms before you submit it to make sure that you have everything in place. There are also some sample consent forms as well, and they provide different types of sample consent forms for different types of research. So you may be able to find one that's more specific to the kind of research that you're doing, and being able then to make sure that you've got all the elements that you need in that consent form. And then finally, once you have all that information together, then you can go ahead and submit your IRB application form, your supporting documents, and then all of the training certificates for all the individuals who are involved in that research study. And you would submit that to Donald Long. So if you go back to the overview, you will see his information here in terms of how you can submit all of your the protocol. okay, for IRB review. You'll notice also on this page that there are meeting dates and deadlines. So depending on your study, it may go through an expedited review, so where really only Don Long and the chair of the IRB board reviews and approves it. Basically, these are studies that are very minimal risk of harm to human subjects. But if there are some concerns or things that they do need to think about, then it actually goes to the full IRB board, which consists of a number of members, and so they only meet a couple times throughout the semester. So you do want to kind of pay attention to the schedule, because if you miss the deadline, then you have to wait until the next one before you can go through that review process. The nice thing, though, is that Don Long will kind of review and look over your protocol before he submits it to the IRB board. So if there are major things that are missing, things that kind of are flags that he knows will be an issue, then he'll let you know ahead of time, so that when it actually goes to the board, you'll have all the components in place. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, and then of course, if there's any information or questions that you need as you're going through this process, then Don Long would also be the individual to contact. Although I believe he's retiring at the end of this semester, so it will be someone else in his place next semester, but the information will be updated on the website. Okay. For research with animals, that link is here under the Committee for Care and Use of Animals. And again, there is a protocol form that you have to go through. You don't have to go through that city training, but you do have to submit a protocol form, provide the supporting documentation, as you would with human subjects as well. There are some policies here that you may want to review in terms of thinking about kind of the ethical issues associated with using animals in your research. So those are things that you would want to think about as you're designing your study, and address any of those issues before you submit your application. And you could submit your application to the chair, Amy McEwen, and her email address is up there as well. So they also only meet, I believe, once per semester. So you do want to make sure that you pay attention to those deadlines as well. Okay, otherwise you'll have to wait until the following semester.